problems have been fixed, and we will go for about another half hour. I apologize for all the technical difficulties, but we are back talking about history, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the Crusades, having just done a series about the Crusades. And then I'm going to get to talk about my next series, which is dropping tomorrow. This one's going to take a while. Basically, I'm doing a video for each president of the United States, so that should be a short video series that takes me quite some time. But anyways, so we are looking at, I was just discussing in the most recent live stream about the breaking news, obviously, with Donald Trump being shot at a campaign rally. I was talking about the history of presidential assassination attempts and presidential assassinations and attempts at maiming and injuring the presidents. One of the most famous examples that I had forgotten to mention, I also talked about the history of presidents dying in office, but one of the most famous examples I forgot to mention, and probably the first major example of a presidential candidate being attacked, happened in 1912. And in 1912, Teddy Roosevelt was running for another term on the Progressive Bull Moose Party, which actually divided the Republican vote that year and led to the Democrats easily winning. And Roosevelt was going to give a speech, and when he was about to give the speech, somebody walked up to him in the middle of a crowd and shot him. And the bullet actually tore a hole through a bulk of papers that comprised his speech. And Roosevelt, who was this strong, energetic, bold man, he used to drink a gallon of coffee a day, just always wired, always going, always ready, got up and went and gave a speech. And he told the crowd, "I have been shot, but I believe you deserve to hear a speech." And Jackson was the sitting president at the time, and the guy ran up and tried to shoot him. Before the gun misfired, and Jackson stared him down, and a bunch of people ran and tried to tackle him, and Jackson took out his cane. Again, he was quite elderly at this time, and started beating the man over the head, which shows you exactly what Andrew Jackson was made of. This is the same president who engaged in many duels and fights and actually had a couple of bullets lodged in his body because he got into fights with people. So it's a long-running history of presidents and presidential candidates who have been attacked, who have been assaulted. There was one time George W. Bush, I remember being a kid and hearing about this, somebody threw an empty grenade up on the stage when he was giving a speech. President Ford was shot at in the 1970s. So a lot of people have talked about the 20-year curse and how presidents die in office every 20 years or something like that. But there have been plenty of presidents who have been attacked at plenty of different times. And it's just a common and sad feature in our country's history. We see this more than in America than we do in places like Canada and Britain. And there are assassination attempts and attempts at violence throughout American history that are quite saddening, especially when the president or the presidential candidate dies. Like I mentioned, the last presidential candidate to actually be shot at on the campaign trail was George Wallace in 1972, and that paralyzed him permanently. And right before him, Robert F. Kennedy had been shot and killed in 1968. So we've got a lot going on. 1968 actually is one of the most controversial and rambunctious, tumultuous years in American history, and obviously Kennedy's assassination came just a couple of months after Martin Luther King had been assassinated. It came in the midst of the Vietnam War that seemed endless and racial divisions that seemed interminable. And it was America at maybe its most divided point. So people are really looking at the political divisions in our country now, but they have been worse. Obviously, the Civil War is the apex of American division. But Vietnam, the 1960s, a lot of people who are alive watching this or watching American politics or living in this country today obviously were alive then. And many may remember exactly how divided the country was at that time. And I would argue historically that America has been far more divided than it is now, and that most of the divisions in America are political. You had deep cultural, social divides in the 1960s, and even deeper cultural divides in the 1860s, when you obviously have the Civil War happening. When you have the Civil War happening, you have America being torn apart because of the social and cultural divisions. And this is actually a huge historical debate amongst people and has garnered a lot of political attention even recently. The idea of what caused the Civil War and the clash of society between the North and the South, the Union and the Confederacy. And I really think that at the end of the day, it is simply that slavery caused the Civil War. A lot of people argue that it was states' rights, that the southern states wanted their rights protected. Their rights to do what? Protect their slaves, protect their, and some say it was economic differences. The North was industrious and populous and full of immigrants, and the South was agrarian and rural. Well, why was it agrarian and rural? Why hadn't it built up factories? Why didn't it have hundreds of immigrants, thousands of immigrants running into its factories? Because it relied on slave labor and plantations. And some people talk about, thank you, I really appreciate hearing that. But a lot of people talk about why talk about population differences, economic differences. At the end of the day, the Civil War comes down to slavery. You can boil it back down to the fact that the North didn't need slavery, didn't want slavery, and didn't want slavery to expand, and the South needed and craved slavery, and yes, indeed, needed it to expand, which is why Lincoln and many of the other Republicans who, at their heart of hearts, were abolitionists and wanted slavery to end as soon as possible, believed that the politically expedient way to end slavery was to actually starve it and suffocate it. And even the founding fathers, many of whom owned slaves themselves. We just celebrated the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson obviously had a lot to do with that. Owned slaves, even though he wrote a part of a declaration where he wanted to get rid of slavery, and Franklin told him, get rid of this. The southern colonies will never stay in this fight against the British if you say we're going to get rid of slaves. But anyways, so Lincoln, like the founding fathers, believed that if slavery was left to its own devices and contained, it would die out over time because it was not economically feasible, socially acceptable, or morally acceptable. And Lincoln, like many others, saw that because slavery was morally abhorrent, it had social and economic and political ramifications that would end up being its own downfall. And you could argue that the slave-based labor of the South, the inability to industrialize, the population being about 35% slave, really handicapped the South from growing and developing at the rate the North was, and that allowed the Union to defeat the Confederacy in the midst of a Civil War. So I know I'm ranting a little bit and getting a little off track, but if you want a time when America was more divided than it is now, and I know today really just kind of backed up those ideas of division and polarization, and it's really, really awful, that's definitely a time when that happened. And a lot of what I'm talking about, America, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, slavery, the divisions of the 1960s and the 1860s, will be covered in my series on the presidents, which starts tomorrow, and those are 1-minute short videos. So check those out. I think I'm really looking forward to doing that, and that's going to take a while. You got 46 presidents, and we have, interestingly enough, we have Trump now, who was the 45th president, who's trying to be the 47th president. And only one other president was able to do that and go and be president twice, but not consecutively. That was Grover Cleveland in the 1880s. So now we've got Trump trying to do it, be the 45th and 47th president. And so America's history is long in that sense, but really compared to world history, European history, Western history, it's not long at all. I had a really great professor in college who described history as a clock, and for him, history, I've mentioned this on the channel before, begins when people start living in cities and writing things down, so history really begins about 6,000 years ago, give or take a few hundred years. And over that span of 6,000 years, if you were to divide it into a clock with 12 hands, you have 12 hours, you have 500 years per hour. So every hour is 500 years. This is called the clock of history. And so you go around, so we've gone around the clock once, and we're starting to go around the clock very slowly but surely. So every 500 years is 1 hour. And America is almost at half an hour. It's 248, about to be 250. That's half an hour of history. So the first 11 and a half plus hours of history did not include the United States. It does include North and South America starting in the 11th hour. The last 500 years you have European involvement. And of course, before then, as should be noted, you have the Native Americans and their contributions, both North and South America. And so their history obviously dates back at least thousands of years as well. Some of them as far back as recorded history itself. But the United States and the European presence and civilization in America is really only something that has occurred in the last hour of history, if you're looking at it from that clock perspective. I love that clock perspective. It's a really interesting one, and when I've shown it to students, they find it's a kind of a mind-blowing moment. So maybe I'll get myself a whiteboard and I'll spruce it up, and I'll set up a little tripod, and I'll do it's um, disproportionate and its disproportionate influence on the rest of the world. So that's, I find, to be very interesting. So we're looking at U.S. presidents. I'm always open for new ideas and new videos. As I mentioned in the last video, Baldwin IV, the Leper King, sorry, cut out there again. Baldwin IV, the Leper King of Jerusalem, who was able to withstand the Muslims during the 1180s, and after his death, his only Saladin and forces large influence on that region of the world really kind of starts there, and also have growing divisions between Christians and Muslims starting there. At the same time that Christians were, as I was studying, I was learning that part of the Crusades wasn't just taking back the Levant and the areas of Israel, Palestine from the Muslims for Christians, but it was also a time for them to retake Spain from the Muslims, because Spain had been a Christian country after the Roman Empire had fallen, the Western Roman Empire, in the 400s, but had been taken over by the Umayyads. And really interesting, they are allowed to practice Islam and not fight in the Muslim army. But basically, as the Muslims continue to take land away from the Byzantine Empire, pushing it farther and farther west and out of Turkey, the Byzantines start asking the Christians for help, and a group of Muslims called the Seljuk Turks eventually kind of overthrow the Abbasids in the Middle East and in the Holy Land, and they start harassing and bothering and stealing from Christian pilgrims who are sometimes walking or sailing or doing all sorts of things, going from Europe to Jerusalem, to Bethlehem, to these important places in Christianity. And so the Muslims start to assault them and bother them, and this and the Byzantines losing their land eventually leads the Western Europeans to come to the aid of the Byzantines, the Eastern Orthodox Christians being helped out by the Roman Catholics, and this starts the First Crusade, where they're actually able, against all odds, to overwhelm the Muslims and retake Antioch and Tyre and some big cities in Israel, and eventually Jerusalem itself. And the Second Crusade is what I was just talking about, where they're able to actually retake most of Spain, and that's really, really huge for the Christians. And by the end of the 1400s, the Muslims have lost almost all their influence and power in Spain, and in 1492, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella defeat the Muslims and vanquish the Umayyads. They were called the Moors at that point, at the bottom tip of Spain, conquering what is called Granada. And to celebrate their victory over the Muslims and the completion of the Reconquista, now that all of Iberia, both Spain and Portugal, are Christianized and free of Muslims, at least Muslim rulership, they do two things. One, they finance the voyage of an Italian sailor who believes that if he goes west, he can reach India faster. He doesn't reach India, not as fast as the Portuguese do go doing east, at least, and that, of course, is Christopher Columbus, and he lands in the New World. And at first he lands in the Caribbean, and he eventually lands in what is now Colombia, the country that bears his name. Columbus does not actually land in North America. It's Central South America. But anyways, at the same time, so they finance this voyage, and eventually Spain is going to become extremely rich by its conquests in Central and South America, and its harvesting of gold at the expense and other cash crops at the expense of slaves, first natives and later Africans that they bring over. At the same time, they also, to celebrate, Ferdinand and Isabella also celebrate their victory over the Muslims and kicking out and getting rid of the Emirate of Granada. by banishing Muslims and Jews from their kingdom. So that's something that is very, that's one way they celebrate. Yes, a question. What's up? This is a Q&A. Feel free to ask me anything at any time, all things history. I am here to help to answer anything that I can. And I'm doing this every weekend. I tried to do it at 6 o'clock Eastern earlier today. That I had some problems with that. And then I did it at 4, had some more technical issues. It's been a crazy day, and I'm still having technical issues. My plan is to do it every week at 6 o'clock. But yes, feel free to ask any question you would like. Well, that question's going in. I'll just continue where I was. The Third Crusade is probably the most famous crusade of all time, and that is what caused the Ottoman Empire to join the Nazis. Okay, interesting. That's a good question. Not quite the Nazis. The Ottoman Empire actually doesn't exist by the time of World War II, and it's because of World War I that the Ottoman Empire doesn't exist by the time of World War II, although the Ottoman Empire was already kind of collapsing. The Ottoman Empire was in decline throughout most of the 19th century, and they were mainly in decline because of the advancements of Britain in Africa, especially North Africa and Egypt, and Russia in Central Asia, and the Balkans, southeastern Europe. So the Ottoman Empire was already in steep decline in the 1800s, and they sign on not with the Nazis but with the German Empire, with Kaiser Wilhelm II, and with the Austro-Hungarians, what's called the Central Powers during World War I. They had originally been called the Triple Alliance with Italy, but Italy broke its agreement to help, and really had never agreed to help an aggressive war with Germany and Austro-Hungary. In fact, Italy fought with the United States, France, Great Britain, and Russia during World War I, and was on the side of the Allies, didn't get rewarded, and that's eventually what led them to embrace Mussolini and fascism. Anyways, sidebar done. The Ottomans joined the Germans, and basically they wanted to undermine Russia's influence, and they thought that they also didn't particularly like Britain and France and their influence in the Middle East and Asia, and they felt that by helping the Germans and the Austrians they could do damage to their enemies, especially the Russians, and they actually did pretty well during the war for the most part. The Allies tried to invade the Ottoman Empire at Gallipoli, one of the most notoriously bad failures. It's an embarrassment for the Lord of the Admiralty, the British politician who came up with it, a man by the name of Winston Churchill, who will be back. But eventually the Allies are able to fight the Ottomans much more easily when the Greeks join the war. So the Greeks join the Allies, and Britain, France, and the Greeks fight the Bulgarians, who have also joined helping the Germans, Austro-Hungarians, and the Ottomans, and of course also the Ottomans. So the Ottoman Empire really wanted to get back on its heels. This war really undermines it. The British really do damage to the Ottomans by supporting the Arabians, and so the Arabians are rebelling at this time against the Ottoman rule, and this is a huge crisis for the Ottomans, because Arabia not only includes a huge population and many natural resources, but it also includes the Muslim holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and you have the Arabs rebelling and not wanting the Ottomans to control them anymore, and so the Ottomans are falling apart, and a British officer named T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, helps the Arabians fight against the Turks with the promise that they will have their own country and their own freedom and liberty in the Middle East. After the war is over, Britain and France decide that basically the native peoples of the Middle East are not educated or civilized enough to run their own society, so they divide up the Middle East. So a long answer to a short question. By the end of World War I, the Ottomans are forced to sign a humiliating peace treaty, just like the Austro-Hungarians and the Germans are. Their empire comes to an end, and eventually they establish their own country under Kemal Ataturk, and that is the Republic of Turkey in 1922. But the Ottoman Empire had lasted for many, many, many centuries, over 600 years, had destroyed the Byzantines, had ended the Eastern Roman Empire, and in effect, any sense of the Roman Empire, and then they ended. And just like all of our empires, they had their time in the sun, they were really powerful, they got complacent, they lost their power, they tried to gain it back, they lost more power, and it's over. Yeah, the Ottomans are a fascinating empire, and in the last year I've spent a lot of time learning about Middle Eastern empires. There's three great, really interesting, it's not Middle Eastern, but Middle East, West Asia, South Asia. there's three great empires, all Muslim empires, all going on at the same time. There's the Ottoman empires, who kind of see themselves as the real leaders of a Muslim state because they have Mecca and Medina, and they're probably the most powerful and well-known one. They're Sunni Muslims. Then there's the Safavids in Persia. They are Shia Muslims who take over after the Mongol kingdom in Persia collapses. And then the last one is called the Mughal Empire, and that's a Muslim empire in India, and that's where we get the Taj Mahal. Taj Mahal is built by a Mughal emperor. And so you've got, and they are also Sunni. So the Safavids, as Shiites, are fighting both empires at different times throughout their history. And so there's really a lot of fascinating history there. And that really helps define today why Persia, and of course now it's known as Iran, became Shia and is now Shia to this day. And if I'm not mistaken, sorry about that. Like I said, connectivity problems everywhere. The Sunni Muslims believe that the best ruler should rule over the Muslim people, whereas the best follower of Allah should rule over the Muslim people, whereas the Shiites believe only a descendant of Muhammad must rule over the people, and that's where you get the divide between the Shiites and the Sunnis. Of course, there's other beliefs and differences. Yes, the Shiite are the minority, but they have had a huge amount of power, and that is how Persia becomes Shiite, and they have remained Shiite to this day. No, I'm good. I'm not that good of an answer, but I do what I can, but I'm not that good of an answer. So the vast majority of Muslims, and like I said, 2 out of those 3 empires were and are Sunni. So, anyways, I think at this time we are going to this live stream. There's an earlier live stream from earlier today. There's last this every Saturday at 9 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, 6 o'clock Pacific. Berlin Congress will be dropping, and I look forward to seeing you all there, and join me next Saturday at 6 o'clock for my next live stream. Take care and have a good night, and stay friendly, my neighborhood historians. Stay friendly.